Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on which side of the Pacific you're on. Thank you very much for joining us for this, the second session of our three-part Oceans of Opportunity Conference, which is being co-hosted by my institute, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the University of the Philippines. My name is Gregory Upholding. I direct the Southeast Asia program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS, and I am really thrilled to be hosting this important conference with support from the U.S. Embassy in Manila. Today, we're going to have two fantastic panels, first on combating plastic pollution, and then on upholding the law of the sea. First, we'll have a keynote from DNR Secretary Roy Cimatu from the Philippines. As a reminder, everything said today is on the record. These videos will be recorded and posted to both the CSIS website and YouTube, so feel free to take notes, ask any questions, share this far and wide if you like. After each of the panels, there will be a Q&A session. So we would ask you to type any questions for the panelists into the Q&A function on Zoom, and please identify yourselves. I think that's it for the housekeeping notes for today's session. So let me turn the mic over to my co-host, Jay Batong-Bakal, who's the director of the Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea at the University of the Philippines. Jay?
Yes, thank you, Greg. Good morning to everyone, or good evening, as you said. Our keynote speaker is, of course, the Secretary Roy Cimatu. He has been a career civil servant, having begun as a military officer after graduating from the Philippine Military Academy. He has previously served in various capacities, such as a special envoy to the Middle East during the Iraq War before he retired. He was also the chief of the armed forces of the Philippines at the time. Just before that. And he has been serving as the Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources under the current administration since 2017. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us give a hand to Secretary Roy Cimatu.
I'm deeply honored and happy to take part in this Oceans of Opportunity Conference of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the U.S. Embassy in Manila. As a maritime nation and as one of the 17 most mega biodiverse countries on our planet, the Pacific Ocean and the seas are of very great importance to the Philippines. This is underscored even more this time when competition over and threats to marine resources are intensifying on our part of the world. This should not be the case. Oceans, especially the high seas, are supposed to create and open opportunities, not threats, disputes, and unlawful barriers. This is why in 1956, the United Nations started the series of conferences and produced what is now the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which entered into force in 1994. This is also why we now have various international conventions on biodiversity, sustainable development, and marine pollution from ships, land-based sources, and exploration and development of the seabed. The Philippines forms part of the Coral Triangle, which is recognized as the center of global marine biodiversity. Fish, crustaceans, mollusks, seaweeds, and other edible marine resources also comprise a vital source of food and livelihood for our people. Our country's impressive wealth of marine life and many beautiful beaches and diving spots have also made us a global ecotourism haven, which has created considerable livelihood and economic opportunities for our citizenry and host communities. The West Philippine Sea also forms part of the route for global maritime traffic from the Indian Ocean to East Asia. It is also believed to contain significant deposits of oil and gas. These are the reasons why our Department of Environment and Natural Resources has been vigorously implementing various domestic initiatives pertinent to marine resources, such as programs on coastal and marine ecosystems management, marine protected areas management, and maritime domain awareness, with emphasis on the areas of the West Philippine Sea and the Philippine Rise. At the international level, with partners in the region, we have been contributing to the Coral Triangle Initiative and the ASEAN Working Group on Coastal and Marine Environment, which addresses marine litter. These are ample and compelling reasons for us to participate in this Oceans of Opportunity conference. We have our very national interest at stake here in terms of territorial and food security, sovereignty and sovereign rights, and biodiversity and other natural resources. This is why issues in our country over the West Philippine Sea are becoming more polarizing with the approach of next year's synchronized national and local elections. And so we are pleased that the United States of America, although not signatory to the UNCLOS, is co-conducting this conference through its embassy in Manila, with National Security-Oriented Center for Strategic and International Studies, a research organization that explores practical ideas that can address the world's greatest challenges. We hope that this Oceans of Opportunity conference can help sustainably secure freedom of navigation and better international protection for the sovereign rights of developing countries in our part of the planet. Through this conference, we hope to peacefully and amicably yet energetically assert the rights to which we are entitled under the UNCLOS, so that we may reciprocally fully perform our obligations thereunder. And so, again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Secretary Cimatu, for taking the time out to record that video for us. We greatly appreciate it. And now let's turn to our first panel. I'd like to introduce the moderator, my colleague, Dr. Whitley Salmweber, who directs the Stevenson Ocean Security Project here at CSIS. Whit, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to our co-host, University of Philippines, and thanks to the U.S. Embassy in Manila for sponsoring this really great conference. So I'm just going to give very quick remarks, introductions here. We have a great panel to talk about one of the most pernicious challenges in thinking about long-term health and sustainability in the ocean, and that's the challenge of marine plastic pollution. And this is a challenge that is one of sources, it's one of sinks, it's one of circular economy, and it's one of health, both ecosystem health and human health. So I'm really thrilled today that we've got a wonderful panel to talk about this challenging topic from a variety of perspectives. I'll just briefly run through each panelist's biography here really quickly, and then we'll roll right into the presentations followed by a Q&A. So first off, we'll be joined by Ms. Denise Triscianti. Ms. Triscianti has been working for over 15 years as a technical assistance expert on the issue of marine plastics at every level, from community organizations to the World Bank, USAID, as well as the government of Indonesia at all levels. In 2014, she co-founded the Sustainable Waste Indonesia, a Jakarta-based research and consultancy firm focusing on sustainable waste management and the circular economy. She'll be followed by Dr. Sandra Whitehouse, who is a consultant who has served for over 25 years as an ocean policy advisor to multiple organizations and institutions. Dr. Whitehouse is a PhD in biological oceanography and uses her expertise to advise clients on how to advance ocean health and sustainable development. She'll be speaking tonight in her role as a senior policy advisor with the Ocean Conservancy. And lastly, we'll be joined by Dr. Deo Anda, who is the Deputy Director of the Marine Science Institute with the University of Philippines. Dr. Anda is an expert in host-symbiote interactions, specializing in microbial biogeography, diversity, genomics, and a variety of other topics. He is also the lead on a number of marine plastics projects, including plastics in the marine environment, microbes, plastics interactions, and a variety of other related topics. So really excited to hear from each of these wonderful experts. And with that, I'm going to turn right now to Ms. Trisyanti.
Yeah, good morning and good evening to some of you. Thank you, CSIS and the organizing team for inviting me in this forum and to have a chance to meet with wonderful people across the world and to discuss the very important issues. So as mentioned, my name is Dini Trisyanti. I'm the director and co-founder of Sustainable Waste Indonesia. Sustainable Waste Indonesia is a research and consultancy company based in Jakarta, Indonesia. And I'd like to say here that my personal expertise is not a marine scientist, and my background is actually a waste engineer. So I've been working nearly 17 years now in this field. And in the last 4 years, I've been involved specifically in plastic waste, marine pollution, and circular economy. So today I will talk mostly about land-based waste management system in Indonesia. It's about how to manage waste after consumption, all type of waste, how to collect, how to process, and how to safely dispose. So, and most importantly in this forum, of course, land-based waste management system that is crucial to prevent the leakage of waste to the ocean. Before going further, I should declare that I'm not the position as a formal representative of my country. I'm not going to present the status of the country or how Indonesia is progressing in tackling marine pollution issues. So these remarks instead intended to share our works, SWI and its collaborators that are still ongoing and still face challenges in many ways. So I should note also that there are many organizations working in this field currently in Indonesia that we should recognize and appreciate their great contributions. So as a start, let me give you a context of Indonesia. Indonesia has more than 17,000 islands. You may know Bali, it's only one of them. More than 500 municipalities, metro cities, big cities, small cities, and medium cities altogether. So they are the main authorities for waste management services. And since 2008, it's 13 years ago, we have the law of waste management in Indonesia. This law has been mandating basic collection service, upstream to downstream, integration, 3R principles, and so on. However, unfortunately, still considerably few cities have managed to meet this law. One of the underlying problems are actually financial, institutional, and political. It's actually not so much about technical. So I'm assuming this happens also in other countries. Should I elaborate these underlying problems? I don't think so, yeah, because it might take 10 hours instead of 10 minutes. So shortly speaking, given the complexity of the problem, what we try to do is we try to bridge and facilitate collaboration. Collaboration to have solution, collaboration that aims to improve at least two things in our mind: municipal solid waste services and circular economy. So what are the collaboration programs that we are working on currently? So the first one is research and assessment. Of course, this involves data and information. This has been our backbone since the beginning of our establishment in 2014. So the area of research so far focusing on post-consumer value chain, the network mapping, the recycling rates, the industry capacity, and even livelihood of informal sector. So we work with brand owners, associations, recycling industries, waste collectors, and other stakeholders along the value chain. So we try to engage them to reveal the reality of recycling ecosystem, the capacity, the challenges and opportunities faced by this recycling industry. It's been a remarkable work for us to do this. So one of our research findings is, in the urban area of Java Island, Java is being the most advanced recycling network in Indonesia. Java apparently only collect around 11% of plastic to recycling stream. This means that more than 88% of plastic waste generated by urban population in Java is still landfilled, or even worse, leaked to environment. So this is what we call the white space. What is also interesting is that among the 11% proportion to recycling that I mentioned, informal sector collection actually contributes to around 84%. So this confirms that very significant role of informal sector collection. So we're happy that the government of Indonesia acknowledged these research findings and involve us in related regulation formulation. So let's moving on to the second one. The second program of ours is strengthening recycling ecosystem. As we become more informed and supported by the plastic recycling industry in Indonesia, we then initiate pilot program that can potentially improve traceability and incremental plastic collection. So we have this program in collaboration with private sectors. Our aim is to leverage at least 300 tons of plastic per month, post-consumer plastics, to be collected and processed by recycling actors. Why do I keep emphasizing the post-consumer? Because in reality, recycling industry is in favor of post-industrial plastic waste. Post-industrial plastic waste is cleaner, more homogeneous, and more predictable, and sometimes cheaper. So this is one of the programs that we have to strengthen recycling ecosystem. In addition to that, we have also assisted several donations since the pandemic hit, from donors, whether it's individual or institutional, private sectors, and so on. So this donation is distributed for COVID-19 relief, especially for the waste workers, informal sector workers. In total, we have distributed PPE, meals, and other basic necessities, hand washing stations, and so on, to around 13,000 households, of waste pickers and waste workers communities in 40 cities across Indonesia. It's quite a huge number for us. So now we are moving to the last one, The third program of ours is business model and technology innovation. So as we know from previous research, globally, Ocean Conservancy said that 61% of ocean plastic is contributed by low residual plastics, or some people call low value plastics. So our research also echoing the similar message. So we challenge ourselves to find the formula for low value plastic processing and also the offtake market of opportunities. And so far, we try material recovery and energy recovery systems. We call our solution should have a 3M principle. It should be mobile, it should be medium scale, and it should be modular. And we do this in collaboration with waste management enterprises, technology developer, and the experts in this field. We have deployed the technology early this year and have invited co-investment and private and public partnership scheme in the business model. But we know this is still a small step. There are still long way and difficult way to replicate and scale up this model in more locations in Indonesia. But we are happy and optimistic with the progress. So I will close these remarks by saying that the problem that we have in waste management will always be finding the middle point of different interests. This is, I think, very often the interest of ecology versus economy. So therefore, I think we are in urgent need of waste diplomacy. Yes, waste diplomacy, not wasted diplomacy. It's not necessarily the diplomacy to manage international relations. No, in my opinion, waste diplomacy is to manage intersectoral expectation, interests, and targets within a country itself. It's been a challenging for us to manage that. Although, of course, the issue of transnational scrap import is something to think about too. So yeah, finally, I hope I can give you insight about the work of SWI in Indonesia and also something to think about. So I'll stop here and I'll leave it back to you, Whitley. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny, for those excellent table setting remarks and some discussion about your work in Indonesia. I think it's good to have a functional sort of engineering perspective as we now roll into some other conversations that'll touch on both engineering, waste management systems, but also some of the ecology. So thank you for that. Now we're going to turn to Dr. Sandra Whitehouse. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Hopefully. I would like to thank you for including me for this great event. So I'm representing Ocean Conservancy, and I'd like to talk about two of our programs that we are working on internationally and in the region, the International Coastal Cleanup and the Clean Currents Coalition. And then I'd like to do a deep dive into our work in Vietnam. The International Coastal Cleanup, we've been doing it for 35 years in 155 countries. We can do a deep dive into the Philippines, has been a very robust partner of ours. We collect all the information of the material that is captured. The Philippines has been one of the countries that has really been a robust partner in the International Coastal Cleanup. In fact, in 2019, of the almost 1 million participants, almost a third of them are from the Philippines. So I'd like to thank you who have participated, encourage others to do so in the future. One of the things that's unique about the ICC is that we not only pick up the material, but we also tabulate every piece of debris. And so we know that food wrappers and cigarette butts are two of the most prominently collected items. We do have an app now called Clean Swell that allows individuals to upload the information directly onto our website. The next topic I'd like to cover is another project that we are working on in the region called the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. Most of you know that ghost gear is one of the most damaging forms of plastic found in the ocean. Not only does it harm reefs, but it also hurts fishermen. The GGI has basically three aims: to improve health, protect aquatic life, and also to safeguard human livelihoods. The GGI is focused on reducing gear that gets lost in the ocean, removing what is already there, and recycling wherever possible. This program has a global reach, and the information is also collected on a data portal. Of course, we have an app for this too, that allows individuals to upload the information. The GGI also has recently put out some best management practices for governments to have guidance about how to manage this issue. Their GGI is doing solution projects all around the world. One of them is in Myanmar. It's in partnership with the Myanmar Ocean Project. Another one is in Indonesia. This project is designed to tag gill nets and allow them to be recovered and returned to their original owner. Now I'd like to take you to our work in Vietnam. This work is done in partnership with our local partner, MCD, the Marine Conservation District, and the Clean Currents Coalition. It's focused on capturing plastic from the river and the underlying science. Like we've heard about in other regions, Vietnam has significant challenges with respect to their waste management systems. The interesting thing about Vietnam, and I know Indonesia has done some of this work as well as other countries, is that the government has taken a great interest in solving this problem. In 2019, they put out a national action plan on ocean plastic waste management that Ocean Conservancy worked with them on. The other reason that we chose Vietnam was that there are approximately 2,300 rivers based on the geography. And since we're focused on doing river plastic abatement, that was an important variable. This work, as I said, is part of the Clean Currents Coalition. It's funded by Koch and the Benioff Ocean Initiative. This map shows where these projects are all around the world. And it also has a data dashboard associated with the project where you can see almost on a daily basis how much material has been collected and their types. Our particular river capture device, which is in the Sanghong River, we wanted to design to be very simple. It's locally designed, it's locally manufactured, and it's not expensive. Therefore, it's very replicable. And we're trying to put 5 into the river. We have 2 in river as of now. We chose the Songho because it's the second largest river in Vietnam. And also because at the mouth of it, there's a very important mangrove estuary, which is the national park. In Nam Dinh is where we're actually putting the river capture devices in the water. We chose Nam Dinh because it's not a big city. It is about 250,000 people, and so sort of manageable in terms of trying to change people's behavior. Nam Dinh has a lot of problems, as we've seen throughout the region. This is a riverbank. And as I said, underlying this project is the science. This slide shows some of our river monitoring sites, as well as some of our river capture sites. This is our intrepid team from MCD, the University of Toronto, and Ocean Conservancy, setting off to do one of their shoreline assessments to be able to quantify anthropogenic debris upstream and downstream from river capture devices in order to be able to establish a baseline. It is relatively simple work, but not easy work. You basically lay out a transect and then count all the pieces of plastic found within that area. Some preliminary results show that, unsurprisingly, plastic comprises the bulk of material found at each site. And of that plastic, quite a bit is hard fragments and foam fragments. This is back to our river capture device. It's relatively easy to operate. The material is collected by local residents, and then it is gathered and classified. It's also weighed and then taken to an appropriate disposal facility. All pieces of material over 2.5 centimeters are characterized. And this just shows from February, the material that was collected. And as you can see, about half of it is plastic and about half was organic material. For the plastics themselves, it's mostly hard plastic. A very important part of the project is to raise awareness among the local residents and the managers. These are some of the local government authorities. And finally, a very important part of the project is our communications work. This is a screenshot from a video that we put out recently that was organized by MCD, and it's in Vietnamese, and it talks about the problem as well as educating people about the river capture devices. And then finally, we are not only doing field work, we're also doing social science, because ultimately the purpose of the project is to be able to change attitudes of people with respect to waste management so that less material will be put into the river and less of it will then flow to the ocean. So thank you. I think my last point is that Ocean Conservancy works collaboratively in coalitions with local partners. And I certainly hope that we can continue to work with our partners in the Philippines as well as finding new ones. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for persevering through our technical difficulties there. That was great. Really, I appreciate it. And I think it was really helpful to see some of the themes that we were talking about from Denny's talk reflected in yours as well, about traceability, the importance of the post-consumer value chain. So thank you again. Now we're going to turn to Dr. Deo Anda. Deo, the floor is yours.
I think Dini and Sandy actually already gave you some very good insights on how the problem of plastics is affecting each and every country, especially in the context of Southeast Asia. What I'd like to do with this presentation is to give you a more broader background and a broader insight that the problem doesn't stay on the coast of each country, that the issue on plastics is actually a shared problem and a responsibility for the littoral states in the that are found along the coast of the South China Sea. You know, a lot of estimations have already suggested that the Philippines is included in the top 10 most plastic contributor in the marine environment, and not far from that are the other Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries. Although these are just estimates, and the Philippines itself doesn't have a data to either validate or reject this categorization, it gives us an insight on what the possible problem is. Many studies also suggested that the problem with marine plastics is that the contribution is not just coming from land, but also coming from the marine environment itself. So with this presentation, I'd like to share some of what we found in the many expeditions that we did around the waters of the Philippines as well as the South China Sea. And all of this plastics actually end up in the ocean, being the sink. And in the context of the land-based pollution, there is an estimate that around 75%, and this is possibly true also in the Philippines, that 75% of the plastics that leak into the marine environment, into the riverine, and then in the marine environment are actually from the land-based, managed from the uncollected or mismanaged waste from the land. And there is another study saying that many of these mismanaged plastics end up in the oceans through the riverine environments. And the Philippines has been tagged to, or has been suggested to actually contribute to this, that 4 or 5 of the rivers, top 10 river polluters in the world are actually found in Manila Bay, connected to the Pasig Riverine system. And this is a big problem in the Philippines because DENR itself has released data saying that many of the landfills or dump sites in the Philippines are actually illegal. Therefore, if they are illegal, they are not of standard, they are not monitored, the possibility of leakage from these illegal dump sites, the riverine and then to the marine environment becomes higher. And the problem, as Sandy actually shared to you, there is a need to baseline. There is a really need to understand where the problem is coming from. And in the context of research in the Philippines, the challenge is that we are only accounting the managed ones, but we haven't really done a very good survey or study on how much plastics are out there, how much of the plastics are actually mismanaged. It is sad because many of these plastics end up in the environment, and the Manila Bay and the Pasig River has become a model for this problem. But after going to the river, where do they actually go? In a study that we did, for example, in Manila Bay, many of the plastics that you found floating in Manila Bay are possibly coming from the river environment, especially the Pasig River. When we try to quantify these plastics floating in Manila Bay, they amount to around 40,000 pieces per square kilometer. And Manila Bay is a big area. So imagine per square kilometer, there are 40,000 plastics. The thing is that Manila Bay is not isolated. It is connected in bigger aquatic systems, in bigger oceanic systems, such as the South China Sea. And when I say that it is a shared problem, because the plastics that are leaking from the different coastal regions actually also end up in the middle of the South China Sea through ocean current. In the many expeditions that we did, this is what we've seen. You find different plastic accumulation in isolated uninhabited islands in the Spratlys Island group. Included there are actually the islands within the West Philippine Sea, the Pag-asa Island or the Thito Island, Kota Island. It's the same thing that we found when we visited Taiping Island, now occupied by Taiwan, and then the Lawak Island. So For example, in an expedition that we did just a few weeks ago, going to the Spratlys, we saw piles and piles of PET bottles in the coast of Pag-asa Island, which is already in the middle of the South China Sea. And the thing is that there's also an island called Lawak Island within the claimed island waters of the Philippines, which is a sanctuary for birds. And these birds, thousands of seagulls and seabirds, and these birds are actually nesting along with the plastics that are depositing on the coast. The problem also with the plastic has been increasing due to the in the context especially of the pandemic, the increased use of disposables, and also the increased patronage for online selling and online purchasing have also increased the number of disposable materials that are leaking into the marine environment. And it's not just that. There's not much data in the Philippines and the Southeast Asia, but many studies have shown that microplastics are also now found in the air, that we are already breathing it. And I think this is where the limitation is coming in the context of the Southeast Asian region, because we do not have much scientific results and actually not a lot of scientific initiatives, though it's already catching up. The other thing is that not all plastics that we found in the South China Sea or in the Spratlys Island group come from the from the terrestrial environment. We have seen and we have received reports that many of concerned citizens are actually finding this different garbage bags full of plastics that are being dumped in the oceans. For example, these plastic bags were found in the Pag-asa Island area in the vicinity of the Tito Island. And it is very visible that these plastics or waste did not spend a long time in the sea. It means that they could have just possibly been dumped a couple of days ago before we found them. So it just means that as we see more vessels coming into the area, as we see more illegal fishing fleets coming to the area, the possibility of ocean-based pollution could also increase. And this is a threat to the natural environment in the region. We've also seen reports of ghost nets, as what Sandy actually has shown earlier, but not only on the coastal areas, or in the municipal waters. A lot of them were also found in the reefs that you find in the Spratlys Island group. And that is actually alarming. These plastics do not stay on the surface. Many reports, for example, in Seabed Canyon in the northwest of the South China Sea, showed that there is already an accumulation of plastics that you find in the deeper parts. For example, Seabed is actually in the 1,000-meter depth in the northwest of the South China Sea. In a dive that we did in the Philippine Trench, which is the third deepest trench in the world, we found the same thing. In March, for example, together with the Caledon Oceanic, we went into the Philippine Trench, and then instead of finding creepy organisms, we found creepier things, which are actually plastics. Imagine 10,000 meters below the sea. It is very concerning because deep sea environments are very vulnerable. They are not experiencing a lot of disturbances. Therefore, any disturbance that would enter into this environment could cause significant effects. It's also concerning because we have not understood yet the deep sea environments, and yet we have already started changing them. If you're gonna go back into the labels of the bottles and the plastics, the packaging that you find in the middle of the South China Sea, these bottles and packaging actually have brands coming from Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan, and even mainland China. I always joke that I call this the ASEAN convention of trash. These islands are uninhabited. It means that, and if you're gonna look into the biofilms that have formed in these bottles, they would suggest that they have drifted for a long period of time, suggesting that they could actually be coming from the coastal areas. There had been a lot of, with the Southeast Asia being recognized or suggested to contribute to marine plastics pollution, there had been a lot of initiatives and also assistance coming from developing countries to launch different initiatives in Southeast Asia. attached agencies. You've got the Japan, UK, and Philippine partnership under the STAND framework. You've got this UK, Singapore, NERC assistance, the SCAP Japan initiative, and the ASEAN Norway initiative to reduce plastics pollution. However, the limitation or the criticism on these projects is that they focus too much on the managing part of the plastic litter, when in reality, the problem also involves the production side or the upstream life cycle of the plastic. So many of the advocates and also those lobbying for policies have been pushing for more stringent guidelines and policies concerning decreasing the production itself, which would then concern the producing countries. And also lobby for science and technology innovation to come up with possible more sustainable solution to plastics, and a ban on trash trade, because many of the Southeast Asian countries are still very much dependent on this, or are significantly involved in the trash trade. And then pushing for more extended producer responsibility and coming up with frameworks, especially in the context of the pandemic. This is important because the South China Sea is a shared environment. Whatever problem that would leak from the different coasts would actually end up in the middle of the ocean. This is a dispersal model showing how the larvae, the eggs of the corals and the fish that are born from the Spratlys Island group could actually end up in the different coasts of the South China Sea. Therefore, any destruction that could happen in the environments in the middle of the South China Sea will also affect the coastal environments that you see in the different parts of the South China Sea. And in the same way, the plastics that are leaking from the different coastal environments could actually end up and cause havoc and damage on the environments that you see or you find in the middle of the South China Sea. Therefore, South China Sea plastics is actually a shared problem and also a shared responsibility. And there is now a call to actually come up with a more regional efforts to actually look at the problem and hopefully come up with solutions to this problem. So I'd also like to remind that we've already entered the Ocean Science Decade. So hopefully we work together towards the ocean we need for the future we want. And with that, I'd like to thank you again. Thank you to the CSIS for the invitation.
Great. Thank you, Dia, for those excellent remarks. I think they really tied the conversation together with that look at the region. So very much appreciate that. As we sort of wait for Q&A questions to come in here, and I just would like to remind folks to please go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get them to the speakers. I'll kick off here and start out with a question. Denny and Sandra, you both talked about scales in a way, and sort of how the right way to work, and to use a phrase from Deo, to manage the litter side of the problem. Denny, you talked about how there's a 2008 law in Indonesia, but federal law, but that the municipalities were having trouble complying with that law for a variety of reasons. And Sandra, you talked about, with the Ocean Conservancy's work in Vietnam, about finding the right size community to work with in order to really test these river trapping devices. I wonder if you could talk about finding that balance between the right way to sort of take a bottom-up approach, what the right part or scale is to do that to ensure success, and yet thinking about what we just heard from Deo in terms of the scale of the challenge and how broad spectrum it is. So from managing the litter side, and maybe we can get to the producer side in a minute, but what would you think, from based on your experience, about how to scale the approach of managing a litter problem? And maybe Denny, we'll start with you. Excuse me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Whitley. In Indonesia case, we have a huge challenge for these issues. Is actually have been there has been research that's showing that most of the leakage of the waste to the oceans are actually coming from the medium and small cities, which we don't really have many regulations and programs and initiatives yet. So in the past years, maybe 10 years or 10 to 5 years before, we are focusing more on metropolitan and urban cities because it's more visual, right? You have a very huge landfills, and you need to have more decentralized system of waste management system. So the government and also the communities are focusing more on the metro and urban cities. And while these issues of plastic pollution to the ocean rises, we become more aware that the small and medium cities are not really been involved and controlled by the existing system. So this is a challenge for us. But now I think the government has already moved to that part, how to engage more the small and medium cities to reach out the whole coverage of waste management services. Because this is the problem of scaling up this coverage of the collection service will imply a lot of cost, because at the moment what we have typically in the big area of medium and small cities, only the city centers have the good and proper waste management collection services. But in the very far areas like the villages or maybe not really villages, but the people that have a lifestyle already similar to the city, they have the same packaging waste, they have the same type of waste in the city, but they don't have access to waste management services. So what happened is either they burn the waste or they buried their waste, or maybe if they're living close by to the river, they dump the waste. So to be able to scale up the collection service, this is going to be a big investment needed, and a lot of political commitment needed from these medium and small cities. And this should be vertically integrated by the national government. Yeah.
Thank you, Denny. Sandra, do you want to say anything about scaling and how Ocean Conservancy thinks about that challenge?
Sure. First of all, I just want to build on what Dini well articulated. This is really not a litter problem. This is a people problem. And plastic doesn't jump into the river or the ocean by itself. And one of the things that we have found on some of the circularity assessment protocols that we are using, which I didn't have time to talk about, is that it's not always, the waste management system, you really have to pick into it and try to understand it. In another area we're working in Vietnam, what we found is there is actually a pretty good waste management system in place, but the people don't understand how to use it. They don't know what pickup days are. They don't know, they're concerned about the costs. And so a lot of waste is leaking into the system. So that's my main point is, understanding the system is really critical. In terms of scaling, I think one of the things that Ocean Conservancy tries to do in all of our different programs is work globally on the plastic issue. And that's why being part of the Clean Currents Coalition has been so useful for these river capture devices. Ours is by far the simplest and least expensive. There's others that are much more elaborate in other areas. But we really are trying to test different types of technologies in different areas to understand the spectrum of possible solutions.
Dave, did you want to comment on this issue of scaling? You talked about extended producer responsibility of looking at this from the other side of the lens. Is there further thoughts you want to offer about that challenge?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. We're just talking about scaling and how we deal with scales. And so my question to you would be, in thinking about where the particular access points are for working with this challenge, thinking about it, moving away from the managing the litter side of the problem and moving into the producer side of the problem, what are some of the access points that you think we ought to be thinking about? You mentioned the litter business essentially that countries in Southeast Asia have with producer countries. Maybe can you talk a little bit more about that and some of the ways that could be addressed?
Yeah, I think one thing that we are advocating for is an interdisciplinary approach to this. Because, for example, in the case of small villages in the south of the Philippines, the problem with plastic is very much associated with economic situation. If you go in the coasts of Palawan, which is an island in the south, many of the plastic type that you will find are actually the plastics that you use to make ice. Ice is very much a big business, for example, in the south, because there's a lot of fisher folks that need the ice. After they catch the fish, they will need to put it into ice. So many of these problems are associated with the economic activity, and they depend on plastics to sell the ice. So this is something that we haven't really looked at. But what will you actually tell the people to stop using, and then also stopping their livelihood, right? So the intersection between the economic need and the need for the plastic is actually very much driven. Is very much driving some of the problems in the context of the Philippines. The second thing that we are pointing out also is that there's not one solution to everything. We have found out that there are a lot of approaches that do not necessarily work in one place but will work in another, and that's the reason why we are advocating also for more research and understanding of the situation. In the national scale, there had been a lot of efforts on the private side of a CSR, corporate social responsibility, for companies to actually take on the responsibility for implementing the EPR. But in the Philippines, we don't have a national policy or national guideline on this. So one thing that we want is to come up with a platform where different sectors can actually advocate, can actually talk about this, and let's accept the problem that there is an economic situation associated with the issue, and how we can help, how we can actually include the people. As what Sandy said, it is not just a litter problem, it is a people problem. But we need to understand the situation of the people so we can come up with more sustainable solution or alternatives for them. So it's really a multi-layer problem, but hopefully by teasing it out, we'll be able to come up with a compromise.
Great, thank you. So we do have some questions now in from the audience. Thank you, and please feel free to keep putting those in, folks. So here's one from Yasser Amin. If a total ban on trash trade were to be introduced, how do we handle the many individuals whose livelihoods depend on jobs such as plastic sorting and processing? So I think that's a really interesting question, is that there is already a real whole economic sector where many folks depend on managing this litter issue as part of their livelihoods. Obviously, maybe we could transition to something else, but is that something that any of you have encountered in your work, and helping people to think about other alternatives to that economic model?
Yeah, can I comment to that question? Yeah, I think what it meant, I assume that the trash ban is the international transboundary import. It's not a local ban on trash.
Yeah,
because
I think maybe instead of saying maybe a trash ban, think about it maybe just in terms of as we move to a more circular economy, or if we were to be able to move into a way that we were recycling a lot more, for example, or reducing the ban. How do we help, or what sorts of questions do we need to think about with regard to these folks who are working with that?
Yeah, I think because it's the two different stories. If it's about the ban on plastics bags, for example, then yes, it will impact to the value chains of the collections, the informal sectors who have been collecting them, and the recyclers and the factories that usually are able to supply the need of plastic bags from the recyclates. They're going to be very much affected, and economy is going to be affected. Of course, that is the facts that we have seen already. And but if it's about the trash ban, imported scrap, like I have mentioned before, I think in Indonesia, at least, a lot of people already have a consensus that it needs to be controlled. It needs to be have like some kind of quota, and the ministries of environment has the responsibility to put that quota and the industry have to comply to that. So I think those two issues are quite important in Indonesia. But the ban on the plastics is the one that is more affecting to the value chains, to the economy, so that some people consider that circular economy is actually not really representing the economy, it's only the circular. So that's just one of the discussion that emerged in Indonesia. But regarding the scrap import ban, the trash ban from developed countries that is, flooding to our countries, that one is really something to combat. I think we agree on that. Indonesia should not be the place to, the garbage bin for other countries, even though some of the portions do contributes to industrial supply. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Dini. Yes, Sandra, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I completely agree. I mean, one thing we've seen in Vietnam is that sometimes even if there's bans, there's still illegal trade in these products, and that's another problem to be addressed. But countries like the United States, we need to step up and be recycling our own material. We need to be investing in that. And when you run the numbers of, plastic polluting countries, that is not always factored in. And so I think we need to take responsibility for our waste. And I know that there's a number of efforts in the current Congress to invest more in recycling. With that said, I do think that the plastics issue is a global issue. And I'm very interested in things like the idea of an international plastic treaty that would really help, all countries have an opportunity to work on this problem from their own perspectives, but in a united way.
Go ahead, Theo.
Probably just to add the discussion, there's a certain, I'm working with an organization based in the Philippines, and the question is that if you actually ban trash trade, will we not be producing enough waste that people can actually make a living out of? The question is, the answer is probably not. The thing that we want is more efficient collection of these wastes, and then more efficient processing of this waste. Many of the waste in the Philippines are not managed properly. Therefore, they do not go to dump sites where they can be recycled, or they do not go to the facilities where people can actually make a living out of them. The trash just really remains trash and then goes into the environment. So by making the process and the mechanisms of collection more efficient and the facilities for recycling more concrete, then I think even if we ban the import of trash, we are producing too much trash that can actually be processed within the country itself.
It doesn't feel like we're going to run out of plastic anytime soon. So we have another question here, and this may be our last, depending on how we get through. We've only got just a few minutes. But Bernie Baskin asks about conflicting policies. So we've talked about some national programs in Vietnam and Indonesia and the Philippines. Are there policies that are sort of working across purposes? We seem to have good national senses in all these places across Southeast Asia that plastic is a problem and that we ought to be working at national scales, regional scales, to combat this challenge. But are there specific policies, either at the state, or we could even say at the regional level, ASEAN level, that seem to be working counter to those policies, those stated aims, if you will? And I'll just open up that to the floor.
Yeah, if I may answer that first. Well, in Indonesia, we have upcoming regulations about excise, plastic bag excise. So it's some kind of taxing of plastic bags. This is a very controversial, in my opinion, and also a lot of people think the same, because when you apply the excise, there will be certain price for each piece of plastic bag. And the price that is planned to be applied is actually like 10 times higher than the price of the plastic bag itself. So when it comes to modern market, like big markets, hypermarket, which the medium and high economy people are doing shopping, they don't really feel the margin of the price. So they, for example, pay the excise of the plastic bags because they purchase a big amount of materials, groceries. But when it comes to traditional market, where you have the culture of buying small things from different shops, then it will impact hugely, because it's like you buy like one tempeh or tofu, and then you have to pay similar amounts of price for the plastic bags. And this is a huge challenge for the government and industry to make a consensus. So this is why I suggest we all to think about the waste diplomacy, because this is something that I think it's not going anywhere if people are still thinking that I'm the right one and you're wrong. So this is something that we have to have a middle point. And in this case, our suggestion is we separate the recycle-based plastic bag to be excluded in the tax regulation. So this is what we suggest, because the plastic bags that made from the recycler, it should not be treated the same as the virgin plastics, for example. So this is what we try to advocate to the government. And I think that is one of the controversial, as we may say, regulations that's going to be imposed.
Great, thank you, Denny. And I actually am unfortunately going to have to cut us off there because we are just at time, but I actually think that's a great point to close on, which kind of brings us full circle back to Denny's original points about waste diplomacy and the importance of that and reaching across boundaries to deal with this challenge. So I want to once again thank all of our speakers. Really appreciate you giving us your time and insights here tonight, and thank all of you for joining us. This is a reminder that we're now going to take a 30-minute break. So please rejoin the conference in 30 minutes, and we'll see you all then. Take care.
Thank you, and welcome to the second session of today's conference on Oceans of Opportunity. Right now, our next session will deal with quite interesting issues that are very much in the minds of many Filipinos, of course, as well as the rest of Southeast Asia. And we have a very good lineup of speakers today. I'll just give you a short introduction. First off, we will have, of course, Justice Antonio Carpio, who is the former member of the Philippine Supreme Court. And he has been, he was in the court from 2001 until 2019, having penned some of the most controversial and most thought-provoking decisions that the court has ever seen. Prior to that, he had been working with government as a part of the Ramos administration before. And in his prior to that stint with government, he had actually founded one of the most well-known law firms in the Philippines, the Carpio, Villarasa and Cruz firm. He will talk with us about one very burning issue, of course, in the South China Sea, which is the Coast Guard, China Coast Guard, and its new law and operations there. He will then be followed by Ms. Tara Davenport, who is the assistant professor at the National University of Singapore and deputy director of the Asia Pacific Center for International Law. She has been working quite a lot as well on these maritime issues, and she will provide us with a very good overview about seabed governance in this area. And then last but not the least, we have Xiao Recio Blanco, who is the director of the Ocean Program of the Environmental Law Institute. Xiao was educated in Spain and the United States, and he taught in Mexico, Europe, and the US. And he will provide us with a talk on small-scale fisheries governance. So with that, I hope that we can then have a very good discussion on burning issues in governance here in our region. So Justice Carpio, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jay. A pleasant day to everyone. Thank you for inviting me to discuss with you a recent development in a region that gravely affects the law of the sea and world peace. International law regulates relations among states. Modern international law has two foundational principles. First is the principle of sovereign equality of all states. Thus, in the UN General Assembly, every state has one vote, whether the state is small or big, weak or strong. Second is the principle that the threat or use of force is outlawed in settling disputes between or among states. Thus, territorial or maritime disputes must be settled peacefully through negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or through other peaceful means, regardless of whether the disputant states are small or big, weak or strong, nuclear armed or not. These two foundational principles of international law, enshrined in the UN Charter, have prevented a third world war in the last 76 years. These two foundational principles establish that right is might and not might is right. However, international law as we know today is under threat by a China which is bent on reshaping international law to suit its national interests at the expense of undermining these two foundational principles of international law. The prohibition in the UN Charter on the threat of use or use of force to settle disputes provides that all member states shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and they shall settle the disputes through negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies or arrangements or other peaceful means of their own choice. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which governs maritime issues, mandates that, and I quote, states parties shall settle any dispute concerning the interpretation or application of this convention by peaceful means, end of quote, in accordance with the foregoing provisions of the UN Charter. In short, international law prohibits the threat or use of force to settle territorial or maritime disputes between or among states, and mandates that peaceful settlement of such disputes through negotiation, mediation, or arbitration. Armed force can be used by a state only in self-defense, whether individual or collective, or when authorized by the UN Security Council to maintain world peace. China's new Coast Guard law, which took effect last February 1, 2021, authorized China's new Coast Guard to fire on ships of other states that fish or conduct economic activities like surveying or drilling for oil and gas in waters claimed by China, even if the waters are situated beyond the territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, or extended continental shelf of China. China claims all the natural resources found in waters constituting 85.7% of the South China Sea. China's claim encroaches on the high seas and on the EEZ and extended continental shelves of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. Under UNCLOS, the fish in the high seas belong to all mankind, and any state in the world, coastal or landlocked, has the right to fish in the high seas of the South China Sea. About 25% of the waters of the South China Sea are high seas. China claims ownership to all the fish in the high seas of the South China Sea. With its new law, China's Coast Guard can now fire on fishing vessels of other states that fish in the high seas of the South China Sea. China's new law is per se an actual threat of force on fishing vessels of all states that fish in the high seas of the South China Sea. This is a clear violation of the UN Charter and of UNCLOS. China's 9-line claim encroaches on the exclusive economic zones of 5 coastal ASEAN states. With its new law, China's Coast Guard can now fire on Vietnamese fishing vessels that fish within Vietnam's EEZ that overlaps with China's 9-line. Even assuming that the overlapping maritime areas are still legally disputed in the absence of an arbitral ruling by an UNCLOS tribunal, still China has no right to resort to threat or use of force to settle a maritime dispute. The threat of force that China's new law authorizes violates the UN Charter and UNCLOS. An UNCLOS arbitral tribunal has ruled that the Philippines is an EEZ in the West Philippine Sea, invalidating China's claim to 80% of this exclusive economic zone. This Philippine EEZ can no longer be legally disputed by China. However, under its new law, China's Coast Guard can now fire on Philippine ships that conduct surveys in Reed Bank or in Philippine vessels that fish within this Philippine EEZ. This threat of force against Philippine vessels is even a more blatant violation of the UN Charter and of UNCLOS. China's new Coast Guard law is an example of China's attempt to reshape international law with Chinese characteristics. These Chinese characteristics are designed solely to benefit China at the expense of all other states. China wants all states to subordinate their national interests to the national interests of China. In the imperial words of a Chinese foreign minister, when he berated in 2010 12 ASEAN foreign ministers, and I quote him, "China is a big country and you are small countries, and that is a fact," end of quote. China today still refuses to accept one of the foundational principles of international law, that all states, big or small, enjoy sovereign equality. China also refuses to be bound by the corollary foundational principle of the UN Charter prohibiting the threat or use of force to settle disputes among states. If China's new Coast Guard law is allowed to stand, both the UN Charter and UNCLOS will no longer apply in the South China Sea and even the East China Sea. These two seas will revert to the situation that existed before the two world wars, where states acquired territories through threat or use of force. China's new Coast Guard law is definitely a grave threat to the continuance of the law of the sea and a grave threat to world peace. The world must therefore resolutely oppose China's new Coast Guard law and seek its invalidation before relevant international tribunals. Thank you and a pleasant day to everyone.
Thank you very much, Justice Carpio. We now move on.
Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here, and thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to take part in this distinguished panel. I feel a little bit intimidated following after Justice Carpio, but I will do my best. I will be speaking on the governance of seabed resources in the Indo-Pacific and some of the legal challenges that arise in governance frameworks for these resources. This is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to be talking about UNCLOS and seabed resources, seabed governance in the Indo-Pacific region, and using the seabed governance in the South China Sea as a case study. Right, so of course, there are a huge amount of resources found on the seabed, right? They include crude oil, natural gas, sand, gravel, phosphorites, tin, polymetallic nodules, cobalt crust, sulfides. There are also living resources, the sedentary species, as well as marine genetic resources. So the seabed is really very rich in many different types of resources that have potential economic wealth. Again, the resources can be located on the continental margin, as well as the deep ocean abyssal plain. The Law of the Sea Convention, adopted in 1982, actually adopts 4 different legal regimes governing seabed resources, depending on where they are located. The territorial sea, you of course have sovereignty over the seabed and subsoil until 12 nautical miles. In the exclusive economic zone, you have sovereign rights over non-living natural resources in the seabed and subsoil up to 200 nautical miles. States are also automatically entitled to a distance-based continental shelf for 200 nautical miles, and over which they have sovereign rights over mineral and other non-living resources of the seabed and subsoil, as well as living organisms of the sedentary species. If you are a coastal state which meets certain geological and geomorphological criteria, you are also able to claim an extended continental shelf. However, you have to, and I will talk a little bit about this later, you have to submit information on these limits to the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf, right? And of course, there you have the area, which is a common heritage of mankind. This is beyond national jurisdiction of any state. And the ISA has the authority over all solid, liquid, or gaseous mineral resources in situ in the area or at beneath the seabed. This is, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this pictorial diagram, right? But you can see the continental shelf and the EEZ overlap, right? But you can claim a 200 nautical mile continental shelf, a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, right? If you meet certain geological and geomorphological criteria. As I said earlier, you have to submit this information to the CLCS. The CLCS has to make recommendations to the coastal state on the outer limit. The limits are final and binding. However, if there is a land and maritime dispute, the CLCS cannot consider the submission. The area, just to give a brief overview, this is the common heritage of mankind. All rights in the resources of the area are vested in mankind as a whole and are to be exercised by the International Seabed Authority on behalf of mankind. If you are a state party, if you are a state-owned enterprise or a private entity sponsored by a state party, you can apply for a license to explore and exploit the deep seabed. I will now talk about seabed governance in the Indo-Pacific region. Right, again, the Indo-Pacific is not a value-neutral term. I know it has different connotations depending on who's using it. I refer to it as a biogeographic region, which links the Western and Indian Oceans and the seas connecting them. Of course, Southeast Asia has a very complex maritime geography. Some Southeast Asian states are located close together, resulting in overlapping territorial seas, EEZs, and continental shelves. The coastal configurations are complicated with gulfs that penetrate deeply in the mainland. And there are, of course, a multitude of large and small islands, some of which are subject to sovereignty disputes. So I've done this table of maritime claims within national jurisdiction. And you can see, I'm not going to go into detail, right? But you can see that I've included all the ASEAN states as well as 2 observer states of ASEAN, Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste. You can see that several of them have actually made claims to the CLCS. However, not all of them have been subject to a final recommendation by the CLCS. I believe only 2. One by Indonesia, and of course, one by Philippines in the Benham Rise region. The others have not been considered for a variety of reasons, capacity issues, as well as the notification that there has been a land and maritime dispute. So this is just an example of the Indo-Pacific region, and you can see the EEZs and the continental shelves in orange. This map was created by my colleague, Yona Lyons, and you can see there's actually quite a vast area which is beyond national jurisdiction. Right, we have Southeast Asia has also been the subject of very active maritime boundary diplomacy. We have 32 delimitation agreements and 12 provisional arrangements consisting of joint development arrangements, joint seismic undertakings, and conflict management arrangements. Again, I now move on to areas beyond national jurisdiction. You can see that in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, over here and over here, there are mineral resources such as polymetallic nodules, cobalt-rich crusts, and polymetallic sulfides and vents. These are exploration licenses which have been issued by the ISA in the Pacific Ocean. Singapore is the only Southeast Asian state which has a license to explore the deep seabed in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. There are also licenses issued in the Indian Ocean. China, the East Asian states, China, Korea, and Japan have a few licenses that have been issued by the International Seabed Authority. Again, repeating this map, and you can see that the licenses are issued somewhere around here and here, okay? All right, I will quickly go through these slides. A case study, of course, we are all very familiar with the joint submission of Malaysia and Vietnam, which is really a game changer in the South China Sea disputes. You can see the flurry of diplomatic notes that it prompted. And then you have the shortly after the unilateral submission of Vietnam. And then this is sort of a pictorial diagram where you can see the extended continental shelves in relation to the Spratly Island disputes. You have Vietnam here, you have the orange area here, which is a joint submission by Malaysia and Vietnam. And then this is another map done by my colleague Yona. And you can see this is after the award, which of course China has rejected as null and void. And you can see in relation to the extended continental shelf claims, there are still some high tide features which are disputed, right? And up here, and these give you an idea of which are high tide features and which are not. Again, Malaysia's submission in 2019, unilateral submission, just in the the northern part of the South China Sea. This is a map I took from an article, and you can see sort of it overlaps with a little bit of Vietnam's claim. And you can see now the seabed resources in the South China Sea are actually covered a lot by these extended continental shelf claims. Right, so these are the, I guess, legal uncertainties or issues or challenges that have been posed to effective seabed governance. And this is a perennial issue, of course, in the South China Sea. Sovereignty disputes and overlapping maritime claims means that both exploration, exploitation, and ultimately effective and sustainable development of seabed resources is hindered. We've all read reports of unilateral oil and gas activities within the 200 nautical mile EEZ and continental shelf of coastal states in the South China Sea being hindered or objected to by China. What the two uncertainties that I see here, can coastal states unilaterally explore and exploit overlapping continental shelves that have not been delimited? So for example, if you go to, I will end soon, sorry. If you go to here, right, can, for example, Malaysia explore this, unilaterally explore and exploit this? Again, the law is not clear. There are two cases which suggest sort of maybe two differing or opposing positions. In the Guyana versus Suriname case, the case law suggested that if these unilateral activities have a permanent impact on the marine environment, they should be prohibited. However, a 2017 case between Ghana and Ivory Coast suggested that unilateral activities that are undertaken in an overlapping claim area are not prohibited so long as they are ultimately found in the area that was ultimately awarded to the coastal state that was conducting those activities. Right, so again, this area of international law is not clear. The second issue, right, can coastal states unilaterally explore seabed resources in extended continental shelves that have not been subject to a final recommendation by the CLCS? Again, your coastal state rights to the continental shelf are inherent and ab initio. They exist without proclamation. You have that entitlement automatically. The Bangladesh versus Myanmar case found that the entitlement to a continental shelf was not dependent on a final recommendation by the CLCS, which would then suggest that there is some scope for unilateral exploration of an extended continental shelf claim, even without a final recommendation by the CLCS. And lastly, Justice Carpio talked about the area, the high seas. Is there an area beyond national jurisdiction, the South China Sea, which would be considered the area subject to the authority of the ISA? Again, perhaps previously at the time of the award, there was all this area beyond national jurisdiction. Right after Malaysia's submission, this has been covered now. You arguably have some area here, but again, we don't know the entitlement of the paracels. So again, another area of uncertainty. Okay, with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Farah. And now, Xiao, you have the floor for the screen.
Good morning and good night, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Xiao Recio Blanco. I'm the director of the Ocean Program at the Environmental Law Institute, or ELI, here in Washington, DC. And we're going to switch gears completely. I'm going to take things much closer to shore. And I want to spend the next few minutes talking about small-scale fisheries governance, and the small-scale fisheries regulatory reforms, because the small-scale fishing sector is, for the most part, not adequately regulated yet, and that needs to change if we are truly to achieve a sustainable development worldwide. So here's the summary. I will just provide a very quick note on ELI, the institution I represent, I work for, and then I spend the rest of my time talking about what ELI has been doing to promote regulatory reforms for sustainable small-scale fisheries. So first of all, about ELI. ELI is a nonpartisan independent research center that was founded in 1969, and I love using this picture to, because I think it helps illustrate things and put things in perspective. ELI was founded the same year the Beatles released Abbey Road, which was also the same year that the National Environmental Policy Act, which was the first major statute of environmental law in the United States, was passed. So we are an institution that has been around pretty much since the inception of the environmental law movement, helping strengthen governance in more than 90 different countries over the last over 50 years now. We are a small independent research center, and we never engage in lobbying or campaigns. Now, as I mentioned, I want to focus on the governance of small-scale fisheries. The importance of small-scale fishing should not be overlooked. About 90% of the world's roughly 120 million captured fishers are involved in small-scale fishing. Small-scale fisheries are extremely diverse, ranging from traditional indigenous fishing practices to semi-industrial fishing. And one basic reason why small-scale fisheries is so poorly regulated is because it's also so difficult to define, especially from a legal standpoint. Seeking to provide some light, to provide some guidance on how to promote a more sustainable small-scale fishing sector, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, published the voluntary guidelines for sustainable small-scale fisheries in 2015. The voluntary guidelines stress the close connections that exist between sustainable fisheries governance, environmental sustainability of the ocean, human and economic security, and the protection of basic human rights. Now, to explain a little bit more of ELI's approach to reforming small-scale fisheries regulations, I need to combine the FAO voluntary guidelines I just mentioned with another study that ELI completed a few years back. For several years, a number of my colleagues at ELI were engaged in a review of environmental laws around the world, which led to the publication of the first environmental rule of law report in partnership with UN Environment in 2019. The report found that the number of countries with framework environmental laws has raised from just 3 in the early 1970s to nearly every country today. But that at the same time, most of these laws lack the capacity to promote actual sustainability because they struggle with implementation and enforcement. Laws usually lack clear mandates, insert concepts that are not well developed, or introduce policy approaches that are not tailored to the needs and conditions on the ground. Agencies that implement sustainable use of natural resources are still often underfunded and politically weak in comparison to the ministries that are responsible for what we could call the traditional, sort of speaking, development or natural resource exploitation. When we zoom in on the management of fisheries, we see many similarities. In most countries, fisheries are paired with agriculture in national governments, and it's usually agriculture that gets most of the attention and the funding. By contrast, small-scale fisheries is a dispersed problem. It's hard to address without sustained efforts, and so it's tempting to let it be relegated in political agendas. So most governments have renamed their Fisheries Act to what now is called the Sustainable Fisheries Act, but without including a specific guidance on how to transition to an actual sustainable management of the fishing resource. And as a consequence, although a Fisheries Act may mention among its implementing principles, for example, community participation in fisheries governance, the regulated community, the fishers, do not have a specific guidance on how to exercise that right. The government agent sitting at a local office does not have the tools to enable that process. Now, my first legal job in Spain before graduating from law school was at the legal department of Toys R Us. And so you might guess that I didn't learn much about fisheries governance working at a toy store. But my boss at that time said something that stuck in my head to this day. And it's that above all, laws have to make sense. Laws need to be logical. And this might sound simple, but however, when we talk about ocean governance, it's evident that the traditional approach that we have followed to fisheries governance and tracing lines in the ocean does not follow and often is in direct conflict with our ecological boundaries. Besides, we do not exactly know what we are actually managing because most national regulations do not systematize data collection specifically for small-scale fisheries. How much is being harvested, by whom, how many of those fishers are registered, how many of those fishers are women, and so on and so forth. So while small-scale fisheries governance considerations are cross-cutting, in most countries, only one ministry has responsibility or is considering the sector. As a consequence of all this, the reality is that policymaking is still mostly overlooking the main stakeholder in ocean governance, coastal fisheries-dependent communities all around the world. And even the new approaches to ocean governance, such as the ones that you might have heard recently about the promotion of a sustainable blue economy or the ocean economy, still tend to focus pretty much on big investments on oil and gas, offshore wind, open water aquaculture, and not so much on the small-scale fishing sector, which is seen pretty much as a kind of a nuisance or a stakeholder that will be negatively impacted by the real ocean investments that will be on other stuff. But despite all these challenges, many of us working on the small-scale fisheries see this sector as the perfect test zone for sustainable development because of the many fundamental rights that are at play here, including environmental sustainability and protection, human rights, food sovereignty and economic security, national security of many countries, and even, of course, the preservation of the natural culture and cultural heritage of many of our countries. So at ELI, we are trying to promote a kind of a different approach that focuses on what seems to be working at the local level to try to find legal principles that then we can use to scale up sustainable small-scale fisheries governance. Our research has tried to identify and present information in a manner that is useful to the legal drafter specifically. The drafter usually, or the government agent, receives the mandate that comes from the General Sustainable Fisheries Act of ensuring sustainable fishing. But that is a very complex task. And what we are trying to do is to provide some model legal language and some guidance that might help understand how to put those ideas into actual regulatory language. And I will conclude with just an example. For example, if the problem that we have with in coastal areas is that we have too many unsustainable fishing practices and illegal fishing, a proposed solution that comes from the FAO voluntary guidelines is implementing co-management, which can be very simply defined as creating mechanisms to enable coastal communities to participate in fisheries governance. But for each specific case, each specific country or region within a country, the legal drafter must consider what does it mean to implement co-management in my country under my legal framework. Does this involve equal decision-making power between the agency and representatives of the fishing communities or not? Are there any constitutional limitations to do something like that, to engage specific groups of people in the management of what are natural resources that belong to the nation? And many of these questions need to be addressed by those that need to work on implementing sustainable small-scale fisheries governance. What we do is legal analysis, so we mostly provide modern legal language, but that is just a small part of what should be a much broader process of assessment to engage in actual reforms for fisheries governance. And these problems, as many of you very well know, need to be addressed soon because the seafood demand keeps increasing and climate change at the same time is reducing fisheries output. And I would love to talk more about this or some of the implementation projects that we have, but I'm going to stop here and I look forward to the Q&A. Also, you have my email address there. If you have more specific questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now open the screen. I just keep saying the floor. It should be the screen. To questions from the audience. Please just enter your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will get right to them. While we're waiting for the first questions, I'd just like to say, that we've had a string of presentations on the theme of preserving maritime law. And just from these three presentations, we see how varied, how diverse these questions can be. We have had presentations that are actually quite interesting because they show us how many levels we need to deal with. On one hand, we have on the international level, we have disputes, of course, in the South China Sea, and we see unilateral actions taken by states creating issues. And then also on the international level, we have some settled law, at least when it comes to, say, the extended continental shelves, which require quite a bit of technical work to do. But then it results as well in possible complications. No, some of them, despite the scientific approach of using geological or geomorphological criteria, it still can result in issues between claimant states. And we shouldn't forget, however, the third level. No, while different states are contesting their claims or their management objectives seem to clash, we should not forget that this has an actual impact on the small scale, on the smaller scale, on the communities that are actually dependent on these marine resources for something probably not as grand as national pride, but something as simple as personal survival. And so we really need to take stock of these issues and see how they interact and how they intersect. So perhaps if I may venture just a few questions for our speakers to start things off. First, to Tara, given the excellent comparison of the various claims that have been made with respect to extended continental shelves, what do you think would be the impact of new submissions given the situation now? We note that two countries, the Philippines and Brunei, could potentially make additional claims to continental shelf areas in an area that's already claimed by Vietnam, Malaysia, and Malaysia. Do you think that such an action, which seemed to have been indicated in note verbals of these two countries, would you think that a submission would help to clarify, or would it only complicate the issues even more if they were to file their respective claims to the central area in the South China Sea? To Xiao, what do you think are the chances of perhaps a cooperative venture or a cooperation from the ground up? Because for years, these disputing states have been attempting cooperation, but driven by at the national level. So you have Coast Guard or Marine Scientific Research, etc. But fisheries has traditionally been very difficult for them to grapple with, possibly because fisheries are the ones that actually create incidents that lead to frictions that could escalate. But what do you think would be the possibility or the prospects of a grassroots level, a grassroots initiated cooperation at least between the fishery sectors of the different countries, given the massive disparities, of course, in their activities? And finally, to Justice Carpio, the problem of the China Coast Guard law and the potential threat it can pose to the surrounding countries, of course, has been the center of attention for the last few months, ever since the Coast Guard law took effect. No? But so far, we see that the China appears to be, at least, appears to be holding back. No? And we have rather conflicting information, shall we say, coming from the ground, where the official line, the official view, of course, is that everything is quiet, and China and ASEAN themselves also always try to keep up this appearance of stability and at sea. But from the ground, we hear from anecdotal evidence, direct testimony, shall we say, from the ground, that things are not as quiet as they seem, and there are actually incidents taking place, but these are not getting out into the mainstream, I guess. What do you think will be the prospects of an incident arising out of implementation of the China Coast Guard law within the next, say, 2 to 5 years? Okay. Thank you. So perhaps Tara, and then Xiao, and then Justice.
Okay, sorry, I apologize. Can you hear my dog barking? Oh, no, it's okay. All right. Thank you very much, Jay, for actually very relevant questions. Firstly, I want to start off my comments by saying it is a coastal state's rights, within a coastal state's right, within their entitlement in the law of the Sea Convention, to make a claim, a submission to the CLCS. And I would actually have to say the 2009 CLCS claims by both Malaysia and Vietnam actually prompted developments which helped clarify the claims in the South China Sea, either directly or indirectly. If there were, and you can see Malaysia's a recent submission has also, as I'm sure you know, prompted a series of note verbals, which have also staked out different countries' positions, and I think has, slowly, we've always thought about the South China Sea disputes as being mired in this sea of uncertainty, but I think the CLCS claims have, in one way or another, started a process that has actually brought clarity to the South China Sea disputes in terms of knowing exactly what our country is claiming. The second issue, though, of course, is that would further claims, and I note that both Brunei and Philippines have reserved their rights to make further claims in the South China Sea. I mean, I can only say, of course, it's within their rights, but it would probably further complicate the issue, right? Because then you have another layer of an overlapping claim. Of course, these extended continental shelf submissions are without prejudice to delimitation, and it would always be open to these various states to come to a delimitation agreement, right, in relation to seabed resources. Again, you have the specter of China objecting, and so that may sort of pose a chilling effect on that sort of negotiations going on. But so I guess my answer to your question is both yes, in terms of clarity on what states are claiming, but at the same time, further complications in terms of the actual entitlement. Thanks.
Thank you, Tara. Xiao?
Sure. So thank you, Jay. That's an excellent question. And by all means, I think that that's an opportunity that we should explore. There are a number of, the main focus right now on promoting better sustainability of the small-scale fisheries sector is on promoting better organized communities. And some things that we are seeing, like for example, within connections between fishing cooperatives in different Latin American countries, for example, is that the process of organization through time is helping develop these kind of informal transboundary networks of fishers and representatives of fishing communities, and they have common problems and common interests, regardless of the geographical location in many times, and that helps build that kind of transboundary connections that might be especially necessary in this case. Another thing that I was writing a few notes as you were formulating the question. One thing that we have been discussing with fishing cooperatives recently is that for the most part, at least in the countries we work, and by the way, I focus most of my work in Latin America and also a little bit in the Pacific. What some of the small-scale fishing cooperatives are complaining about is that they are not represented when their countries go to the RFMO negotiations. RFMO negotiations usually tend to represent kind of very parochial interests, large industrial scale, and having the voices of small communities participating in those debates would also open another door for transboundary cooperation or for hearing different versions of the story. I know my colleagues in this panel know much more than me about international environmental law, but I think I remember that some international maritime boundaries also recognize traditional fishing rights. So that might be yet another way of expanding that. And I mentioned that also just to go back to the idea that I think one thing that we, and by we, I mean those working on ocean governance and ocean sustainability, need to explore much more is on realizing that the ocean is one big ecosystem and needs to be managed in a much more integrated way, which leads to the question that at a certain point, we're gonna need to really expand the approach to transboundary coordination on fisheries governance. And sorry, on ocean governance in general.
Thank you, Sean. Justice?
Thank you, Jay. 2 points. First, China is telling the ASEAN coastal states that China will be very prudent, will be very reasonable in applying its new Coast Guard law. But we must not fall for this trap, because the moment we accept that China can use force beyond waters under its jurisdiction, then we will be at the mercy of China. It will become a sword of Damocles over our heads. We must oppose resolutely any law of China that allows its Coast Guard to use force beyond its jurisdictional waters. So we should never accept the proffer of China that it will be very reasonable in using its new Coast Guard law. There is no such thing. The Coast Guard law violates international law because it allows China to use force in waters beyond its jurisdiction. Second, we are running out of gas in Malampaya, our largest operating gas field, and we will have to make a move to get the gas in Reed Bank, which is within our EEZ. Vietnam's oil and gas reserves are also being depleted. They will have to explore and exploit the oil and gas within their EEZ. And Malaysia will also be doing the same thing. So in the next 2 to 5 years, there will be a situation where the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, even Indonesia will be exploring gas or oil within the 9-dash line, and China will have to decide whether to enforce its Coast Guard law or not. And I think there will be an incident because even in the absence of the Coast Guard law, you have a standoff between Vietnamese and Chinese Coast Guard vessels already. So there will be an incident. So before that incident arises, let's find a way to question that Coast Guard law of China before an international tribunal to strengthen our position. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice. Perhaps you can follow up on that point with the question from the audience that's on our chat box. How can relevant actors in the South China Sea confront a China so committed to the 9-dash line, which blatantly violates international law? And is there a practical way to negotiate and cooperate with China, or is adversarial conflict inevitable? I think this is actually the principal problem that most of us involved in research in South China Sea always has to face. Perhaps anyone? Perhaps we can do it in reverse order. Justice first, then Xiao, then Tara. If you have thoughts on this.
Well, the Philippines is an arbitral award saying that we have an EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. And it's a question of enforcement. How do we enforce this against China? Well, every 45 days, the US and its allies conduct freedom of navigation and overflight operations in the West Philippine Sea in our exclusive economic zone. And every time they go there, they conduct naval drills. And they are refuting the Chinese claim that there is no EEZ of a coastal state in the West Philippine Sea. When the US conducts naval drills in the West Philippine Sea, they are conducting naval drills in accordance with UNCLOS because in the EEZ, you can conduct naval drills, foreign warships can conduct naval drills. And so they are actually enforcing the arbitral award against China because they're saying this is an EEZ of a coastal state. And there's only one coastal state in the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines. So there is an enforcement and it's happening every 45 days. And I consider this the most robust enforcement of the arbitral award because it's physical enforcement. There are other ways of enforcing it. We can have a joint patrol with Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia on our exclusive economic zones in the West Philippine Sea. In our EEZ, we can invite Vietnam, Malaysia, or Indonesia to conduct joint naval patrols. And we will be telling China that we have an EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. The same thing with Vietnam. We can join Vietnam on a patrol in their EEZ to show to China that these are the waters under the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam. So there are ways of doing it, but it requires political will. And of course, when we file, as Tara explained, we can file an extended continental shelf claim of the coast of Luzon. And we do that when you file an extended continental shelf claim, you assume that you have an EEZ because the extended continental shelf claim starts from the edge of the EEZ. So if we file, for example, in Luzon, the only opposing state will be China. And what will be the basis of the opposition of China? Because there's already an arbitral award by an UNCLOS tribunal that we have an EEZ. China cannot use the 9-dash line anymore against the Philippines. The UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, I believe, will have to follow the arbitral tribunal because that's part of the UNCLOS system and say that that opposition of China based on the 9-dash line is not a valid opposition. Or we can bring the matter again to an UNCLOS tribunal. There's no problem there. So when we file an extended continental shelf claim, we are saying we have an EEZ and we are backed up by that arbitral award. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Tara, any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think yeah, I mean, I echo what you said, Jay. This is a sort of a perennial problem that we face in the South China Sea. This constant debate between international law and international relations, right? Is might right? I have to be optimistic and say certainly there are always options to negotiate and cooperate with China. But again, yeah, it has to be on equal terms, right? And there has to be an atmosphere of trust between the relevant parties. I think that's all I will say on that.
Thank you, Tara. And finally, Xiao, perhaps especially on the issue of cooperation, which I think is one point that is very important to emphasize.
Yes, I really don't have anything to add after what we just heard. Yes, maybe as a general comment on that need for better transboundary cooperation in fisheries governance. As I was saying before, we see that as new communities are getting more organized, we are seeing more a higher number of transboundary connections, some economies of scale with, for example, cooperatives in the European Union buying specific species of seafood from cooperatives in West Africa or in Latin America, and building those connections. And of course, that element of trade is always a good element of cooperation and a deterrent of other approaches.
Thank you. Thank you, Xiao. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our time period. I really would like to please join me in thanking our speakers for giving us these presentations and which are really thought-provoking. We see the interconnection really between national, international, and community here in these presentations. And I really am glad that some of these issues, particularly the issues of small-scale fishers and how they're affected by these contending national claims, how they relate to each other, has been highlighted. No, so please join me in thanking our speakers, and we will end this webinar at this point. Those of you who may wish to join the breakout groups will have received the information, and we will see you then. Other than that, we will see you again in next week at the third session of our Oceans of Opportunity conference. Thank you very much for this morning or this night, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.